They moved all 4 tents into a perfect square while we slept. It's the sentence I still hear in my head when I try to explain that week to anyone who wasn't there. 3 friends and I decided to go car camping for spring break. Nothing fancy, just a cheap cooler, sleeping bags, and the kind of reckless optimism you have when you're 21, and your biggest worry is making it back for Monday classes. Buena Vista area, Colorado, late March. Snow melt everywhere. The air still that crisp, clean ache that makes your lungs feel new. There were 4 of us in the clearing. Me, Kevin, Ali, and Seb. We picked a dispersed site off a dirt spur loop, just enough trees to feel private, but not so thick that you'd get lost walking back to the cars. We set up our tents in a scatter, one by the fire ring, one by a toppled log, one near a knobby pine, the usual college camping geometry. We joked about bear spray, roasted a couple of frozen hot dogs, drank beer until the stars blurred, and then collapsed into our bags like it was the end of the world. I remember falling asleep weirdly fast and hard, as if something pushed me under. The next morning is what I can't shake. I woke to a silence that felt like wallpaper. No birds, no creek chatter, just a low, delicate wind. I pushed the zipper of my tent up, expecting to see dawn light and our backpacks scattered where we'd left them. Instead, I saw something that refused to arrange itself in my brain. 3 other tents, spaced equally around a center point, their doors facing inward like the set to some unscripted ritual. In the middle, 4 stones, stacked one on top of another, neat, balanced, as if someone had the time and patience to make them perfectly vertical. I sat up, and my stomach dropped. Kevin's head poked out of his tent on the opposite side, Ali swearing under her breath, Seb blinking like the rest of us. We all said the same thing at once, in different words. We didn't do this. The tents weren't just moved a few feet. They'd been arranged into a perfect square, one at each corner. The stakes were still holding. They weren't ripped. Our sleeping bags, our shoes, our phones, everything was where we'd left it inside the tents. Nothing taken, no sign of a fight. The canvas doors opened to the center like a hush. There were marks, not footprints, no trails of boot treads leading into the clearing. Instead, in the soft, muddy ground between us and the stone pile, there were faint lines, 2 parallel grooves here, a shallow, scraped arc there. They stopped about 10 feet short of each tent. It looked like whatever moved them had been lifted, or, worse, laid down gently, leaving nothing in the last stretch to show how the tents had arrived at their new places. The dirt under the tent pegs was undisturbed. If someone had carried our tents in, they'd done it without leaning against the stakes or dragging seams across the ground. It made no sense. We walked the perimeter, muttering and trying to rationalize. Wind, Seb offered. We'd have noticed it last night, Ali answered. Animals? Kevin asked, as if expecting a deer to show up and shrug apologetically. I remember the cold smell of pine and something else, metal maybe, or old river stones warmed by a low sun. The pile of stones in the center looked like it had been assembled carefully. Similar size rocks, each balanced on the one beneath, stacked to the height of a fist. 4 stones, 4 tents. That's the other thing that never sat right. We'd all had very specific, very similar dreams the night before. I bring this up not to be mystical, because I don't believe in coincidental herd dreams, but because the detail is concrete and awkward. 3 of us awoke with the taste of dust and counting in our mouths. Kevin said he dreamt we were walking in line, counting steps out loud, 1, 2, 3. And the count never went higher than 7. Ali dreamed of someone laying pale stones in the sun, fingers careful. Seb had a marching feeling, like boots on pavement that never touched ground. For me, it was a rhythm, a pulsing, distant sound in my bones that I thought might just be a truck or the river, but it felt close, measured. We compared notes, mostly to laugh the edge off. Weird coincidence, Seb said, and scraped a pebble with his fingernail. We tried to be practical, hypotheses thrown out like hands feeling for a ladder in a dark alley. Some hiker with a grudge? A group prank? A local legend we'd stumbled into, but nothing lined up. No footprints, no trash, no evidence of someone staying overnight. Except, of course, for the stones and the grooves that led up and then simply stopped. We did the stupid thing. We touched the stones. It's ridiculous when you say it out loud, but there was a gravity to that little stack, an urge to dislodge its balance. Kevin reached down, fingers jittering, as if with a reflexive need to prove the thing was real. He nudged the top stone with the pad of his thumb. It fell, clacked onto the rest, and for a moment the clearing was simply the sound of stone on stone. Then something answered. It started as a low, far-off rumbling, like a glacier thinking of moving, or a heavy gate being pushed open in slow motion. It didn't come from the road or a truck. There was no road audible from our spot. The sound felt like it moved through the earth, under our feet. We all went quiet at the same time. The hair at the back of my neck prickled. Kevin looked like he wanted to laugh but couldn't. Ali put her hand over her mouth. The rumble grew a breath, then faded. We stared at the empty tree line as if expecting a figure to appear. Nothing. But the silence after the sound was a different animal. Tense, expectant, like a held breath that didn't release. We packed. That's the clean way to say it. Tents folded, sleeping bags shoved into bags, coffee forgotten. None of us wanted to be the first to say what we were thinking, to admit that maybe the woods had been occupied in some way we couldn't see. We manhandled the gear like people trying to move a past. Our fingers were clumsy. Ali swore because she dropped a little photo magnet she'd brought, the kind you put on fridges, now dusty with camp dirt. Kevin kept glancing back at the clearing, at the empty center where the stones lay disrupted and ordinary again. On the drive back down the dirt road, the mood was brittle. We didn't speak much. The radio was on low, more for background than music. At one point, Kevin laughed too loudly at a commercial, then immediately apologized, in a voice that was too loud and too small at the same time. We all agreed we wouldn't tell anyone, part shame, part not wanting to be labeled as the gullible fools who thought tents walked on their own. But you can't bury something like that. That night back in town, we sat in a diner drinking greasy coffee and saying everything in fragments. We tried to fit the pieces together, but the grooves that stopped 10 feet short and the perfect square didn't have edges you could match. In the weeks after I noticed the rhythm in my chest more often, small things triggered it, a clack of a stone underfoot, the sound of a zipper, a counting voice on an old movie. We never went back. The four of us drifted, not dramatically, no fights, no cinematic split, but quietly. Ali changed programs and moved cities. Kevin got a job that kept him weekends. Seb stopped camping for a while. I thought about asking them if they still dreamed of counting, if it had stopped for them. I never did. What haunts me isn't the stones themselves. It's the scale of patience it would take to arrange something like that without leaving evidence. It's the calmness of the act. If someone had done all that simply to unsettle us, if it was a prank, then it was a patient, methodical prank whose maker wanted silence, not revelry. If it wasn't a prank, then there are possibilities that feel worse to think about. We never found an answer. We told ourselves explanations until we believed them. Probably campers, Seb said on our last drive away, voice flat with a too-easy shrug. Maybe they wanted to use our tents for warmth. But when you awake with the same dream as 3 other people, a counting, a march, you stop being patient with ordinary answers. The surreal thing is how ordinary the rest of the day was. A sun that climbed, a sky that was reliably blue, and the same grocery store food when we stopped near the highway. Yet the center of the clearing had rearranged itself into an accusation we couldn't read. I keep replaying the scene where the top stone fell, as if it were some kind of trigger. What if we'd left it? Would the rumbling never have started? What if the stones were a map? What if we were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? We were idiots, youthful, loud, reckless, But we were also careful enough to know when to hold still. That morning we held still, and it didn't help. If you're the kind of person who eats true horror stories for breakfast, hit like and subscribe. There are more of these. I say that not because I'm trying to build a channel, but because there's something small and necessary about stories being told. A way to swap the weight of them so they don't live inside one chest. My second story starts with a napkin and a stranger. My name is Simon. I was 24 and bored with the city. Cadence, my girlfriend at the time, had a lighter laugh than her voicemail and a habit of leaving a little trail of glittery stuff in the car, chapstick, receipts, a hair tie she swore she'd been using but never seemed to have. Harry National Forest, North Carolina. We went camping at a small campground where the sites are spaced enough to feel private but not lonely. It was late summer and humid as a wet sweater. We picked a spot on the edge of a loop, near a stand of pines that made thin, rattling noises with every gust. The campground had maybe a dozen sites, and a faded wooden sign at the entrance warned about ticks and advised you to register. People strolled by with dogs and kids in the evenings. Everything felt pleasantly, mundanely safe. We set up the tent, made easy food, and Cadence laughed at something I said, which was enough to make the trip worthwhile. A man introduced himself that evening while we were starting the campfire. He had a blue sedan parked on the access road, hood cool under the night. He said his name was Aiden. He was in his 30s, maybe, with an easy, almost clumsy manner. At first he seemed like any of the locals who stopped to chat, curious and overly friendly. He asked about our plans for the next day and offered vague advice about some trail that was really worth it if you don't mind the bugs. He talked too long for someone who initially seemed harmless. Something about the way he watched the trees made my teeth tighten just a notch. We talked with him for maybe 20 minutes, Cadence asking about mushrooms, and me pretending to be uninterested but feeling oddly watchful. Then he walked back to his car. We thought nothing of it. He waved goodnight. The campground grew quiet. The usual chorus of crickets swelled and then receded with intermittent car lights on the road. At about 2:30 in the morning I woke to voices. It felt like someone was leaning next to the tent, speaking in low, urgent tones. At first I thought it might be radio spillover from another camp, but the cadence was wrong, low, deliberate, way below the pitch of casual laughter. Cadence was still asleep beside me, breathing slow. I unzipped the tent with my head and listened. The sounds were faint and indistinct. They might have been people, or animals coughing, or a trick of the wind through pine needles. I told myself to go back to sleep. Morning came with a different kind of wrongness. The windshield of our car had a folded napkin tucked beneath the wiper. My heart took one of those sharp, judicial jumps that past experience has taught me never to ignore. I opened the napkin with my thumb and unfolded a single sentence written in block letters. "You should move your tent." That exact phrasing, 3 words, flat and crisp, a simple warning, not a joke, not a polite suggestion. We looked at each other, and then at the campground like people passing a parcel they weren't sure was safe to touch. Cadence's face went pale, and for a second I thought she was going to laugh awkwardly to diffuse it. She didn't. She folded the napkin as if it might sting and handed it to me. Aiden was gone from his car. The blue sedan sat empty, its keys maybe still in the ignition. He came back not long after, the same face, the same clothes. He walked with a slow, easy gait, like a man who owned the path. He told us a story about the area. Nothing that could be fact-checked immediately. A loose local history of strange things people sometimes saw out in the woods. His voice was casual, his eyes weren't. When I asked him about the napkin, he shrugged, like a man indulging a question he didn't need to answer. "You shouldn't be sleeping that close to the tree line," he said, which is not a response to a napkin, but somehow served the same purpose. It tightened the knot of unease. The day passed with a strange, watchful quality. We tried to keep moving, to be logical, tested lines of sight, packed our belongings in pairs, kept the car between us and the dark. We talked through options like adult campers who didn't want drama, move a few sites over, stay until daylight, ask the ranger. I wanted to call the ranger because it's the sensible thing to do, but my phone had all the charm of a paperweight. No bars. The campground sign promised coverage near the ranger station, which was not where we were. We couldn't stop seeing eyes in the trees. I'm not speaking literally, no figures moving between pines at noon. But you get a sensation of being observed in a way that doesn't come from humans next to you. Cadence stopped wandering from the tent alone. She kept her keys like a talisman in her pocket. We drank warm coffee that tasted like metal. After hours that suffered from a slow, heavy cloud of anxiety, Aidan drove by again in his blue sedan just before dusk and waved. When he raised his hand, it felt like a threat and a benediction at the same time. I want to be fair. Aidan didn't threaten us. He performed an odd paternalism. He told us we were lucky to be young, he warned us not to wander after dark, and then he offered to help if we needed anything. There was something in the way he said luck that suggested a different notion of fate than mine. We accepted his help with too much eagerness, which in hindsight looks like hunger. He warned us not to leave the area alone. He told us to keep our tent zipped. That night the voices returned, louder this time, threaded through with the sort of laughter that doesn't reach the eyes. I couldn't sleep. Cadence tried. I unzipped the tent and listened. The sound came from somewhere back of the line of trees, too loose to identify, but close enough to make my chest tight. I had this ridiculous animal impulse to check the car, to ensure everything was locked, like some child who double-checks a bedroom door. Come morning, I found another sign, this one tucked under the passenger wiper, a folded napkin, again clean edges, a message meant to be brief and precise. You should move your tent. I held it and felt like an idiot for feeling something else inside it, a directed, attentive caution. The campsite felt different, like a stage that had already been set, and we were the actors who had missed their cue. We started getting ready to pack. I should say that I told myself all the rational things. Maybe it was a harassment prank. Maybe some local was trying to keep us from camping in that spot because it was, for some reason, kept for other folks. Maybe the note was meant to be kind, a neighborly warning about sinkholes or falling branches. The mind is excellent at building scaffolding out of emptiness when it needs something to stand on. Cadence wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and tried to make a joke about suburban ghost hunters. Her laugh fell flat. Aidan came back. He stood at the edge of our sight, hands shoved into his pockets. "You two heading out?" he asked. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "That rain last week messed with some spots out there. You shouldn't stay on that side," he said. The implication was thin and thick at the same time. Move your tent. It echoed the napkin. It felt like confirmation with a soft blade. At that moment I should have felt grateful. I should have thanked him and moved the tent and gone. Instead, I felt torn, as if a coin had been flipped and both sides were void. I asked him why he'd left the napkin. His attention slowed. For a second his face read like a photograph, familiar and distant. "I like to look out for people," he said. The words were banal, but the way he said them pressed like a thumb against my ribs. We debated. Cadence wanted to leave and go to another campground. Part of me wanted to say yes and be done. But there was a stubbornness in me, a test I didn't realize I was performing on myself. Was this a test of courage or paranoia? We delayed. 20 minutes became an hour. We were packing slowly, as if procrastination could armor us. When we finally started to drive away at dusk, the setting sun backlit the trees like a smear of lacquered gold. We hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when Cadence screamed. I slammed the brakes. The car fishtailed a little in the gravel, and the world shrank to the sound of her voice and the smell of dust and a sharp, hot smell I could not place. In the tree line, 3 figures stood, pale and still between the trunks. Visible, not hidden, simply aligned like pieces on a chessboard. They were not moving toward us. They were standing in the deeper dark with their heads turned toward the road. They were not wearing jackets, not holding anything obvious, just standing. There was no rustle, no flee, no apology. We drove. I held the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Cadence grabbed the passenger seat and whispered, "Call the ranger." I tried. No bars. The blue sedan was a smear in my rear view, lights on but not following. When I finally found signal and called from the highway, the voice on the other end took my information and told me to stay on the road and to call back if the people returned. The voice was patient. The creak in my chest would not be soothed by instructions. We made it to service and called 911. We told them about the napkin and the figures, about the man who introduced himself as Aiden. They took our statement. They said someone might check the campground later. We drove home in a kind of stunned silence, the highway droning and the radio offering idiotic pop songs that seemed obscene next to what we'd felt. Afterward came the legal limbo of worry. The ranger said they'd patrol more, but they didn't confirm whether they had seen anyone. I called the campground number the next week, asked them for any records. The owner said there had been odd reports before, nothing actionable. The blue sedan was a detail that floated without anchor. Aiden's name was a mouthful with no person behind it. We never heard whether anyone found the figures in the tree line. We never heard if Aiden had left for good, or if he had been the one leaving the napkins. I still think about that napkin. I still taste the cheap paper in my teeth when I imagine it. I still wonder whether Aiden was trying to warn us or control us, or doing both in the same movement. Sometimes, watching late-night shows about small-town mysteries, I think of the way his smile held quiet things. Other times, I think of the 3 figures in the trees, how they didn't move when we screamed. They felt less like people and more like punctuation. A period that closed a sentence we hadn't finished writing. There's no closure to that story, not in a neat, satisfying way. We left. We got help. The ranger was polite and reasonably competent, but the nagging question remained. Was Aiden a caution or a threat? Did the napkin mean we were being protected or warned away for reasons we didn't deserve to know? The ambiguity gnaws. I was supposed to be driving Cadence to a safer site. Instead, I left her in my rear view and drove into a sense that we had stumbled into someone else's pattern. The thing with patterns is they often continue whether you see them or not. I'll stop there for now, because the last detail I'd planned to tell you plays like a photograph I can't smooth out. The way Aiden answered when I asked him why he'd put the napkin under the wiper. He looked right through me for a second, then said, as if it were obvious, "Sometimes people need a reminder." I don't know who he was reminding. I don't know what the 3 figures were waiting to remind us of. And I don't know whether we were the only ones those napkins were meant for. I don't know whether we were the only ones those napkins were meant for. After we left that campground, I did what people do when a small, strange thing is shoved into their lives. I tried to ignore it and failed. I replayed Aiden's smile in my head until the edges of it blurred. I checked our photos from the trip, looking for a face in the background, some clue I hadn't seen. Nothing. The sheriff's office called once to say they'd run the patrol logs. Nothing concrete came back. The campground owner said they'd been seeing odd reports, but nothing that rose to the level of a criminal investigation. The blue sedan didn't appear on any local posts or complaints. Aiden became a name that had weight and no body. Cadence insisted for a little while that we never camp again. I protested and we compromised. We didn't go back to rustic spots for months. We took short trips to state parks where other people filtered into your campsite at dusk and left by noon. That routine held until the small fissures of normal life widened. The job became a thing that required longer hours, friends moved, bills arrived, and the memory thinned. But it never left entirely. Whenever I tell that story, I taste the napkin between my teeth and feel for a breath the watching in the trees. Sometimes I imagine a version where Aidan was just a worried local whose idea of neighborliness was clumsy and paternal. Other times I imagine a darker possibility, and that thought is a slow knot that refuses to smooth. Either way, the napkin did what it was meant to do. It made us move, or at least it made us leave sooner than we would have. It made us notice that the woods had their own rules, and that sometimes you were not the only thing moving through them. The third account starts in a place so remote it makes your teeth ache to imagine it. I was 28, divorced for a year, and had decided that the thing I needed more than anything was to get as far from people as possible. I'd been in Scouts as a kid and spent most of my 20s doing work that required planning and patience. I was not inexperienced in the backcountry. I knew how to read a map and where to pitch a tent to shed rain. But the kind of solitude I wanted then wasn't the week in a crowd at a popular trailhead. I meant off-grid, no cell signal, no marked sites, a place where my head could stop making small things into large terrors. Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest, Montana, late September. The higher ridges had already started to taste of winter. The air was thin and carried a clean, bitter smell you associate with places that only wind and cottonwoods have shaped. I hiked in for a full day with a heavy pack and found a clearing beyond a deadfall the size of a pickup truck. There was a tent, old mold pretty much in every fold, canvas sagging with damp. It looked as if someone had left it in a hurry or never come back. Nearby, half buried in duff, I found a small spiral notebook with the front cover gone and pages browned by weather. On the first page were groups of marks, 7 lines crossed by 1, repeated over and over, rows and rows of 7. I didn't know who had been there. I didn't know whether the tent's owner had walked away or been chased away or simply moved to another place. The thing was, nobody else seemed to be looking for the tent. There was no smoke ring nearby, no fresh food scraps, no cigarette butts, just that tent and the notebook. I felt that peculiar combination people feel when they find evidence of someone else in the wilderness. Curiosity, sharpened by the small alarm of finding a life parked where you expected solitude. I pocketed the notebook. I told myself it was evidence, if there was anyone to tell. I put the tent fly over my own rain shelter and set up my camp on the opposite side of the clearing, out of sight of the mouldy canvas. I made myself a small fire and tried to catalogue my options, like a man weighing facts instead of feelings. The rational parts of me, scout training, a dozen trips into places where the help arrives on a different calendar, argued to leave the notebook where it was. The less rational part said to take it for the night, to keep it close, to read until my eyes bled, if that's what it took to understand why someone had stacked marks in groups of 7. I kept the notebook by my sleeping pad and read through it at the fire. The groups of marks repeated, sometimes with small numbers in the margins, 7, 7, 7, rub, rub. There were a few pages with tiny handwriting, single words, names maybe, but everything looked like it had been written in a hurry or with a hand that was trying to steady itself in the wind. On one page there was a crude drawing, a circle of stones with an X at the edge and a small arrow pointing outward. The notebook was not the journal of a pleasant hiker. It felt like a ledger for something private and urgent. That night the forest changed its voice. At 2 in the morning I woke to something that sounded like a whisper and a zipper. At first I thought some animal had crawled into the tent by accident rhythm of the canvas, but the sound was human in cadence. A small hand on smooth fabric, a quick testing pull that left a crisp line along the zipper's seam. I lay still and held the rifle I keep when I sleep in places where my throat tightens. The sounds came again, a whispering that might have been breath, might have been words if my brains had been generous. Then, someone moving around my tent, a soft pad of feet, like barefoot steps in dry leaves. I shouted. The shout was a bone-deep, surprising thing. It carried into the trees, and the night answered with nothing but distance. The zipper stopped. The footfalls retreated. I clicked the safety off the rifle and unzipped one side of the tent enough to peer out. The world beyond the rainfly was a smear of dark and a small ring of my firelight. Nothing. No figure, no rustle, no clothes hanging on a branch. Just the silence of the kind that tasted of other people's presence. Morning came with daylight that felt too bright for what we'd all pretended the night had been. The old tent, the mouldy one, was gone. Not packed, not folded, not flattened. Gone as if it had never existed. The duff was smooth where it had been, with the disturbed pattern of someone who'd been there and then left in a hurry. Around my camp, I found a ring of barefoot prints, irregular and small, encircling my tarp like a fragile crown. They weren't human-sized in the usual adult sense. Narrow, calloused edges that suggested someone who had spent a great deal of time moving without shoes. Worse, some people, had taken a knife or another sharp tool to the nearest living tree and carved a series of tally marks, 7 vertical strokes crossed by 1. On the bark, the cuts were fresh, the sap still dark along the edges. The notebook's pattern matched the tree with unnerving precision. Someone had written in paper and in wood the same thing. Someone had then left a message that could be traced in both weathered pages and living flesh. And then there was the squirrel. It was small and dry, its body tied by the tail to a low branch at eye level, left like a message or a punctuation. I saw it the second I walked the circle and my stomach dropped. It wasn't gore-filled. No need for explicit detail here, but the placement was surgical, tied so it wouldn't move. Not eaten, not scattered. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something inside me flip from curiosity to dread. Everything that had felt like a riddle now felt like a statement. I packed fast. I don't mean melodramatic sprinting. I mean efficient, practiced hands doing the work of leaving. I stuffed the notebook into my pack and scooped up the tarp and rolled my sleeping bag with the precision of someone who'd been a scout, but knew how to do it with adrenaline in their veins. I slung the rifle on my shoulder and carried it with the careful slowness of someone who wanted it to feel like an extension of his intention to get away. I didn't call the authorities, not right away. There was no signal. Even when later I found a spot with 2 bars, the thought of making a formal report felt strangely wrong. Like waving a flag and inviting the attention of something that had, until then, been content to leave only those silent messages. I knew the practical side of the equation. Rangers could search, maybe find nothing, maybe find evidence that accelerated questions I did not want to answer. I was tired, and there was a part of me that wanted to keep the notebook. In the end, maybe selfishness played a role. The knowledge that I had a proof of something unreadable felt like a talisman against disbelief. On the hike out, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound became a footstep. Every curved shadow was a crouched figure. At one creek crossing, I paused and opened the notebook in the light, as if I could learn something from the way the pages shivered in the air. On the inside of the back cover, someone with a different hand, less hurried, had scratched a single line, "They count." Under it was a date, and then nothing else. When I reached the highway, I left the notebook in the glove compartment of my truck for a week. I meant to drive back with a friend. I meant to hand the thing to the ranger. The notebook stayed there, warm during the day, cold at night, and I kept slipping a hand into the glove box to touch it like it was a talisman or a festering wound. Eventually, I took photographs of the pages and then mailed those photos to a ranger station 2 counties over. I asked them not to publicize what I'd found, not to run it through the channels that create alarms. They sent back a curt email, "We'll check the area." That was the last official word I got. I half expected that someone would call me stupid for keeping the book. Instead, I got silence, and then the quiet hum of my own thoughts. A month later, I found fresh tally marks in the margin of the photo I had taken. I don't know if that's possible. That damage could appear on printed paper the way it did in the field, or if it was some trick my mind played to keep the story alive. Maybe I was lying to myself. Maybe I was making sense of nothing. Those are the loops a person walks when they have a strange thing caught in their chest. Sometimes at night, things that feel like coincidences line up in a pattern so tight you can taste it. I tucked the photograph under a stack of bills once, and when I reached for the mail I saw the corner of the page and saw again that exact 7x1 pattern carved somewhere that could not be rationalized as a prank. How many people would go into the woods and carve the same signature into tree bark and paper without being in some kind of contact? How many people would leave sewn messages, dead animals, balanced stones, notes, that pointed at each other but never explained their message? I never met anyone who owned that moldy tent. I never found who had tied the squirrel. I didn't want to go back alone. A friend eventually came with me. We hiked the same hour-long track and stood in the clearing. The place felt different with company, less intimate and less hungry. We found nothing, no tent, no fresh marks on the bark, no prints. The duff had smoothed to the way of it. It was as if the clearing had closed like a mouth, swallowing the evidence. The ranger I spoke to a second time asked whether I'd left the notebook in situ. I said no, and the questioner sounded disappointed. He told me there was nothing to investigate without hard evidence. I told him that's what had broken my trust, the proof of oddness that vanished more often than it stayed long enough for rational systems to touch. That's the thing about deliberate acts left in the wilderness. They count on the remoteness to become unaccountable. They trust the world's vastness to be their accomplice. Whether they were the work of bored locals, a small group with a ritual we didn't understand, or something else, I never solved it. I never found a motive, never found a messenger to ask, "What did you mean by that?" I learned that it was possible to live with an unanswered indignation. I learned how quickly the brain can normalize the terrifying as a fact of life. On nights when the world is quiet, I wake with a start and the sound is familiar, thin fabric being tested by a finger, a zipper being eased open and shut. My pulse jumps. I lie still and try to listen for whether the sound will come again. Most times it doesn't. Once in a while I dream of a ring of barefoot prints encircling the place I thought I owned for the night. Sometimes the notebook sits open and its pages are blank. Sometimes they are filled with marks I don't remember seeing before. That is the cruelty of a thing that means to haunt you. Unpredictability becomes its weapon. I left the rifle in the closet when I started coming back to town more regularly. Someone told me later that if you live long enough with a weapon, you wear it into your manner. Your shoulders carry it even when it's not there. There's truth in that. But there's also exhaustion, the kind you feel when you realize some things won't present their faces to you. The notebook sits in a drawer now. Once in a while, I take it out and flip through it like a person rereading a bad omen, trying to decode it as if a fresh admonition will reveal itself. It never does. What remains is the small thing carved into my memory, 7 marks crossed by 1. A pattern someone else used to mark their presence. A tally of something only they could name. I tell you these 3 stories in close succession because they share a frame. The wilderness is a place where ordinary elements, stones, a napkin, a tree, become statements. In each case the message was deliberate, patient, and not meant for the uninvited. In each case, it stopped short of overt violence, which somehow sharpened the taste of fear. A silence that implies a threat without showing its hand. The college trip where the 4 tents were rearranged left me with a rhythm that set under my skin, counting, the sound of a stone toppling, a rumble that felt older than us. Simon's napkin and the three figures in the tree line left the question of motive wide and twitching. Was someone protecting those woods for a reason the rest of us weren't allowed to know, or were we a target of a stranger's cruel game? The tallies and the squirrel in Montana carried an unnatural patience. Someone taking time to mark, to tally, to leave messages that read like language without grammar. What ties them all is the refusal to explain. Whoever left those signs preferred the slow terror of ambiguity to the finality of explanation. They turned normal things into cryptic proof that someone else had been there, watching and making a small, purposeful imprint on our temporary lives. And when you can't read a message, your brain fills the letters with the worst possible meanings. I don't know what to tell you in the way of comfort. I can only say this. If you spend a night under trees and you wake to something that feels wrong, if you find a note, a carefully balanced pile of stones, a tree marked in a pattern you don't understand, consider two rules that helped me. First, trust your unease enough to change your plans without trying to rationalize the danger away. Second, don't assume any single explanation is the right one. Ambiguity is often the point. Beyond that, there's nothing tidy. If one thing comforts me, it's this small human thing. Telling a story shocks a little of its weight into the world. So if you've been in the woods and something happened that made you look over your shoulder and not sleep that night, if you have a napkin, a notebook, a photo, a carved tree, share it in the comments or send it to the channel email. These stories exist because people tell them, and in telling them, we trade a little of their burden. If you liked this series of true camping horror stories, subscribe and share with someone who camps alone more often than they should. I'll leave you with the memory that sits behind each of these. The impression that when people mean to leave a message, they do it in things that look ordinary until they aren't. And when they do, what they leave is often more disturbing than anything they could do with force. The slow, deliberate suggestion that the forest remembers, counts, and does not feel obliged to explain itself.